Today on Inside Utah Politics, the 2020 census. It's a crucial count to determine federal funding, political representation, and more for our state. We are digging into everything you need to know to make sure you are counted.
Time now for Inside Utah Politics.
Thanks for joining us. I'm Glenn Mills. It is time to go inside Utah politics. Today we are dedicating the entire show to the 2020 census. We begin with Mallory Bateman. She is the State Data Center Coordinator. She joins us just outside of the studio. Mallory, great to have you with us. Let's get right into Census 101. What is this all about?
So the census is a once-a-decade opportunity to count everybody living in the United States, once, only once, and in the right place. And it's very important for our political representation, both in DC and down at the local level, for our allocation of funding, which we can get into a little more, and then also for looking into the future. We're a state that's always had growth, and so being able to have a new baseline starting with 2020 helps us look forward.
Let's get into more specifically why this really matters to Utahns here in our state, because it really impacts us in many different ways. Let's start with education. Talk about how it impacts education in the state of Utah.
Yeah, so education, obviously, I don't know if everyone knows this, but we're the youngest state in the nation. We have a lot of kids compared to other states, and so we have a big chunk of our population that we need to know how old they are. We need to be able to have that baseline of kids, and then it helps with planning for new schools. Districts can look at their growth and try to look forward into the future using that 2020 baseline. But because this is a count of everybody, it's a little different than some other sample-based efforts.
Yeah, education obviously obvious here in the state of Utah given the large amount of kids. What about infrastructure, the roads we drive on?
Yeah, absolutely. So one thing that is a local allocation of money is B&C road funds, and that is half of that allocation is based on census numbers. You know, if you look at Federal Transit Administration or other national funding programs, these numbers really mean a lot to being able to fund these road projects.
Healthcare also an obviously important issue in our lives. We're seeing that now more than ever. Talk about the impact on healthcare.
Yeah, so I mean, one thing that's really important, and there have been a series of studies from the George Washington Institute of Public Politics, and they've looked at how funding breaks out in states.
Okay,
and
right
across every state, Medicaid, Medicare is the biggest allocation from the federal government, and that's the same in Utah. Also, children's health insurance is funded in Utah using those census numbers, so a lot of funding comes into the state, as well as our big medical systems using these numbers to kind of look at their baselines and figure out what they need to serve their communities.
We're going to get more into the economic impact in more detail in a little bit, but talk briefly about business development and the impact the census has on that.
Yeah, so business development, it's kind of similar, and I'm a little bit outside of that typically because we're normally in the government realm, but you know, businesses need this information to plan for their services, to plan for new branches or locations, to figure out who they're serving and what's the best way to reach out and interact with the community.
And we talked a little bit about political representation. Our representatives are based on population.
Yeah.
Are we potentially looking at maybe adding another seat this year? I've heard we're probably not to that point yet, but talk about that.
I haven't seen anything showing Utah gaining a seat. Interesting, other states around us, like Colorado is kind of projected, and also Montana is projected to gain another representative, so they've been working really hard up there. But down at the local level, this is going to impact politics from our state senate all the way to like city council, school district representation. You know, we've had so much growth in the Wasatch Front. We've added almost 450,000 people throughout the state. And so it's mostly been in the Wasatch Front that growth has occurred. And so within the Wasatch Front, you're going to see changes in districts through the redistricting process in 2021.
Okay, let's get more into how this all works. Who should be counted in your household?
Everyone living in your household as of April 1st should be counted. You know, one hard to count population, interestingly enough, is kids 0 to 5. People seem to forget to count their little children, so remember your little kids. But you know, if you have a non-traditional household, if you have multiple families sharing a household, everyone should be included on your response form.
Okay, that's a really important point, because April 1st Wednesday, April 1st is Census Day. That means if you filled it out before or if you fill it out after, you're going back to the 1st on
Yeah.
that day to make the count, right?
Yeah, and that's kind of your point of reference for all of this data. You know, it could be any time in the year, but April 1st was when the Census Bureau decided to have be Census Day, and so that's where everything should kind of be centered around.
Got it. So here in Utah, we have lots of missionaries out in different parts of the country, the world even. It's my understanding you do not count a son or daughter who's on a mission.
Right. If your son or daughter is not living at home on April 1st, they should not be counted in your census response. If they're serving in another state, they would actually be counted in that state. So, yeah, they're a special population just to Utah that a lot of other states don't
Yeah.
have to interact with.
Yeah,
Yeah.
that's for sure. All right, let's talk about how to participate. It's easy. I've already done mine. I just jumped online and did it. That's really the most simple way to do it.
Yeah, and it's available online for the first time ever, which with everything else going on right now is actually very convenient. So you just go to my2020census.gov and you submit your answers. For my household, it's only 2 of us, but it took maybe 5 minutes. There are also some phone lines you can call, and both the online form and phone lines are available in English and 12 other languages. If you wait a little bit longer, you might get a response form in the mail, but for the most part, try to respond early using the online response or the over-the-phone response.
Okay, and real quick, we have about 30 seconds left. If you do not respond, you might start seeing people go door to door, but I understand that's been pushed back due to the coronavirus.
Yeah, so it's been pushed back about 2 weeks at this point. We'll see how that all unfolds as everything else keeps developing. But just get your response in. It's easy, it's quick, and it impacts us for a decade.
Okay. All right, so really the best way to do that is online, and then you don't have to have people coming door to door, and I believe that's been pushed back to mid-May at this point through August. So we will see how that develops. As you mentioned, we're pretty lucky to have it online for the first time this year, given what we didn't know was coming our way.
Yeah, it was an exciting development anyway, but now that we have this outside circumstance, it's really convenient, and hopefully will make it easier for people to respond.
All right, Mallory Bateman, thanks so much for your time. We appreciate all your knowledge on the census. Thanks for being here.
Thank you.
Still to come, Utah is known for having one of the top economies in the country, and the census, as we mentioned, does play a role, more of one than you might even think. We'll get into that after the break. Welcome back. We turn now to the economic impact of the 2020 census and how local communities are getting involved in that impact. For that, we turn to Juliet Tennert with the Kempsey Gardner Institute and Byron Russell. He is with the Complete Count Committee. Great to have both of you with us. You're joining us via Zoom. That's how we do business now. Let's get right into it, Juliet, talking about how the census impacts our economy here in Utah, because it probably impacts it more than we realize.
Yeah, sure, absolutely. And as an economist, I'm going to admit that I'm biased here, but having accurate information, it's the single most important element in making decisions that support our economic growth here in Utah and the economic well-being of individuals. Policymakers here in our state, business leaders, individuals and families, they cannot make sound economic decisions without accurate information. And having this information from the census, where we understand how many people live in certain areas, what the demographics of those people are, is so critical to those economic decisions.
Yeah, talk more about that, because not only based on the overall population of one county, but the demographics. Get more into that, what demographics are taken into consideration and why that is so important.
Sure, absolutely. So, for example, understanding age is really important. We have a number of, for example, federal programs where federal funds come into the state for to support certain individuals. Understanding what the age profile of different communities is so critical. Understanding the race ethnicity profile of certain communities is so critical. Truly just understanding the individual communities helps to really target certain funds, make certain decisions.
And there's also an important public safety and emergency preparedness element to this as well. Get into that if you would.
Yeah, so absolutely. Again, you can't make a decision about where to build up your public safety infrastructure or your emergency services infrastructure without understanding what the population is in a certain area. What is the age profile in that certain area? We have scarce resources, right? There's scarce funds to provide these services. So it's really important that we leverage them the best that we can. and we get those services delivered in the right places. I think a really good example, very, very timely, is all of the response with COVID-19. Again, limited resources. And so understanding where that population is helps us to best use those resources.
Okay, Byron, let's turn to you and talk a little bit more now about how communities are getting involved. Why is it so important for individual communities to get on board with this and do what they can?
What the census needs to do, and is doing, and I think very well, as you've seen so far, is just trying to find the hardest to reach. And doing that takes a lot of effort, and it takes a lot of communities and a lot of stakeholders to get involved. And that sometimes takes a little funding. And so the legislature provided $1 million. Half of that went to marketing through the Department of Workforce Services, and then the other were grants. And with $500,000 in grants, one of the quandaries is how to find the hard to reach. You have to really find communities who are working with them. And that is something that really blew our mind, because when we sent out an announcement that we had these grants to fulfill, it required us to be able to contact them and get them to fill out the grants. The $500,000 was exceeded by the demand, which was 2.1 in requests. So we knew that there was a lot of support out there to make sure that hard to reach communities were found. And doing that involved a lot of stakeholders who were community leaders. They were members of corporations like Goldman Sachs, Intermountain Healthcare, American Express sat and helped us learn how to best give out grants, to make sure those grants were measurable, and to make sure that we were meeting the needs of finding those people who were hardest to reach in Native American communities, ethnic communities like the Black community, Asian communities, Latino communities, Pacific Islander, and others. And the hardest to reach are children 1 to 5. So how do you find them? And so finding these organizations who can help us do that have been invaluable to us, and their success is already showing itself.
Mm-hmm. Juliet, let's bring you back in. Utah, one of the fastest growing states. So how will the census play a role in that growth as we continue to move forward?
Yeah, well, it plays a role in many, many ways. Just understanding that growth is really important as state policymakers try to figure out where to put roads, water infrastructure, business. I think that having this very accurate count will continue to fuel our growth into the next decade here in Utah. When businesses making relocation decisions, they're thinking about consumers, like where consumers are that are going to buy their product. But with e-commerce and globalization, more importantly, when businesses thinking about location, they're thinking about workforce. And so having an accurate count, understanding who is in the state of Utah, is going to help to draw business into the state and continue on that economic growth path.
And let's get more into how private businesses actually use the data from the census, because there are some people who are skeptical, saying, I don't want to give out my information. Talk about how that's being put to use.
Sure, and again, it's put to use in many, many different ways. As I mentioned, it helps to understand a consumer. It helps to understand the demand for a certain product or service. And so as businesses trying to figure out where they target their resources or where they target their marketing, it's a very useful tool there. And then as I mentioned too, it's that labor force component. And business it's critical, right? You can't be successful in business without a good workforce. And so these census data help us to understand where workers are. I think you'll see that in decision making all over the place. And then, again, it's all about information. So, every decision is based on this.
Byron, let's bring you back in. How is this being received as you see communities going out and making those outreach efforts?
Well, we want to make sure that everyone feels that they're heard and everyone feels that they're being counted. And we also want members of the minority communities throughout the state to know that this is really to benefit their communities. And, we look at disparities sometimes in health. We look at disparities in education. And it's hard, as Juliet mentioned, to find and dedicate that information and apply that information unless it's accurate and unless everyone is counted and unless everyone feels that they're counted, because it's fair if you, in that 10-year stream of time, when you miss this opportunity to fill out your census form, I think some people say, gosh, I wish I had either known about it, I wish I had participated, and I wish I was counted. And so this is the time, this is the moment, this is the year. Every 10 years, you get your chance to do that. And it's up to us through the legislature's appropriation to make sure that we find you, that we know where you are, and that you know and understand that this is for the purposes of being counted and of the benefit of your community and education and in business, but also services. And just like we're seeing today with COVID-19, it's very difficult to make sure that we're reaching out to everybody unless we know where they are and who they are represented.
Okay, far-reaching impacts here, no doubt about that. Appreciate having both of you with us this morning for this important conversation. Thanks for being here.
Thanks so much.
All right, still ahead, the goal of the census is, as we've been talking about, to count all Utahns. Coming up, we'll get more into the plan to make sure hard-to-reach communities, even rural communities in our state, are included. Stay with us. During the 2020 census, there's a focus on making sure all Utahns are counted. That includes those in rural and hard-to-reach communities. For more on that angle, we bring in Salt Lake County Special Projects Coordinator Marty Wolford and Tooele City Library Director Jamie Monk-Carter. Great to have you with us, both of you joining us via Zoom as well. Marty, let's start with you. When we talk about hard-to-count communities here in the state of Utah, define that for us. What are we talking about?
Yeah, hard-to-count communities are communities that have been historically undercounted forever. So these are people who have limited English proficiency. They may be from a different country, and so they weren't here in 2010, so they just don't understand what the census is. Lower income people and renters, people who are over 65, people who live in rural areas, and people experiencing homelessness, as well as college students and millennials.
Okay, Marty, let's stick with you for the time being. What's being done to reach these hard-to-reach communities in our state?
Yeah, so the state had a grant opportunity that went to community partners that were able to work with these particular groups of people. And then Salt Lake County has been also working with community-based organizations to do a lot of census outreach and education. It's our kind of strategy that if a community-based organization is well trained in the census, then they can answer questions and talk to their communities and help assist them with the census. And so we've been working for the past 2 years on forming the strategy, working with community partners, doing trainings, to going 1,000 miles an hour with this. And now we're a little slowed, but our idea is that the people who are trusted partners in the community are those community-based organizations, those grassroots organizations, those faith-based organizations. So we work with them so that they can disseminate that information down to the ground level.
So on the topic of university students, let's clear this up. If they're living on campus and away from home, how are they specifically counted? On their own residence or through their parents' residence?
If you're living in a college dorm, or if you were living in a college dorm, you will still be counted by the school. So if you are now living at home with your parents, you should not be included on the census with them because the school is working to get you counted. If you were living in your own apartment off of campus, you should be counted at that address.
Okay, good information there. Jamie, let's turn to you now. We mentioned that you are the director of the library in Tooele. How are you encouraging those in your community to participate in the census?
Well, we were one of the recipients of those grants that came from the legislature, and we're so grateful for that. What we had envisioned was a 3-part strategy where we would encourage early response, where we would go to where people are, and where we would motivate word of mouth through gamification. So because of social distancing, it is tough to go where people are because they are at home. So we are restructuring our strategies or our actions that support those strategies right now. One thing that we have going for us, especially as public libraries, all through the state, is we have these great relationships with every piece of the community. There's not a particular demographic, one or the other, that we have or that we don't have, that we are acquainted with and that we have trust with. And so we have people calling us to say, can you help me navigate this online environment? so I can get this done. Typically, we would have done that in the library, but
Okay, so we're having some trouble with Jamie freezing up there. Let's go back to you, Marty. Talk specifically about rural impact and why it's important for rural populations to be counted and represented.
Yeah, the rural populations, they're just as important as any other community in the state. What we have, the infrastructure is different though in rural. And so people are more spread out, they're farther away, they may not have access to internet at the same level as the Wasatch Front area. And so it's really important that we utilize technology so that we can reach them, because otherwise, if we're not making it easy for them to participate, then we face the possibility that they're not going to do the census. And that's a big concern. So the libraries, they were a central point for these communities. The libraries in our state were ready to assist people with the census, and they were our touch point to reach a lot of communities. And now that they're closed, we're asking people to go online, to do it over the phone, or to do a paper version. If they're not able to do that, just hold tight. When the libraries open back up, hopefully, in the next month or so, we'll be prepared to assist people who need help with completing their census.
Yeah, talk more a little bit about the impact of COVID-19. How far can we possibly push this back if need be?
Well, so now it's pushed back. Originally, census was going to be wrapped up July 31st. It's been pushed back to August 14th. If it gets pushed back further, it's an act of Congress. So the data needs to be submitted to the president by a certain date. And for that to be changed, that's an act of Congress. We're all learning from this, and we're just going to kind of see what's going to happen. But right now, I think August 14th, it's feeling like, maybe July and August, that first part of August, that's what we're doing, is we're just hitting the ground really with all of our efforts to make sure that we're able to reach people. And there are live maps with the Census Bureau, and we can see which census tracts we may need to really go out and do a little bit more get out the count efforts with. And so we can be well prepared when the time comes to reach communities.
Okay, we will see how that plays out. One last thing I wanted to hit on with you real quick. We have about 30 seconds left. There was a lot of talk about legal status and the census, and people were afraid to come out based on that. What's your message to those folks?
So there's no citizenship question on the census. There's no question about your status in any way. And the census determines funding at the community level, and your communities rely on funding, and we really need to know how many people live in our state so that we can do an even distribution of money. Up to this point, it hasn't been evenly distributed because we've had an undercount in communities that are harder to reach. And so that's why I encourage people to know that the census is confidential. Your information will not be shared outside of the Census Bureau, and it's extremely useful and important for your community.
Okay, we are going to have to end it on that note. We really appreciate you joining us. Thanks so much for your time. We appreciate it. Stay with us. Right after the break, we will take a look at important dates and deadlines for the census. We'll leave you now with a look at important dates for the 2020 census. The respond period began on March 12th. Wednesday, April 1st was Census Day. May 7th through August 14th, census workers will begin knocking on doors of those who have not responded. For more information and to take the census, go to census2020.utah.gov. Thanks so much for making us part of your Sunday morning. We hope to see you again next week as we go inside Utah politics.